Japan carries more debt than any nation on Earth, over 250% of its GDP, and yet there's no panic, no bailout, no collapse. While other countries scream about deficits, Japan walks calmly through the storm. You'd expect markets to react, bond yields to spike, the yen to crater, but nothing, not even a ripple. Why? Because they could borrow more easily, cheaply, without consequence, and they choose not to. This isn't fiscal recklessness, it's restraint, and it's the quietest economic revolution of the last 50 years. If you've been taught that debt is inevitable, that growth demands borrowing, that governments must spend to survive, Japan is here to question everything you believe. Another country with debt this high would have been downgraded years ago. Greece, Italy, even the United States. Each one lives under constant pressure from lenders, rating agencies, and global investors. But Japan, it owns itself. Nearly 95% of its debt is held by Japanese citizens, banks, and the central bank. Foreign investors barely blink. No one's calling in their loans. No one's demanding austerity. This isn't magic. It's control. They've built a system where money flows inward, not outward. Where the government isn't begging for cash from abroad, it's recycling its own savings into its own future. And that changes everything. Think about your own household. If you had $300,000 in credit card debt, but every dollar you owed was owed to yourself, your spouse, your children, you wouldn't sleep any worse at night, would you? That's Japan. The state doesn't rely on overseas lenders. It doesn't need to dazzle Wall Street. Its bonds are bought by retirees, saving for nursing homes, by small shop owners burying cash under floorboards, by pension funds that have nowhere else to go. These aren't speculative markets. They're domestic lifelines. And because the Bank of Japan quietly buys half of every new bond issued, yields stay pinned near zero. There's no drama, no fireworks, just stability. A silent engine, humming. Most people assume inflation is the threat, that printing money will eventually burn the value of the yen. But Japan's tried that for 30 years, and still prices barely budge. Why? Because the average citizen isn't spending on luxuries. They're saving. They're cautious. They grew up in the aftermath of asset bubbles and lost wages. They don't trust easy money. Their grandparents survived rationing. Their parents watched homes vanish overnight, so they invest in security, not splash. The government mirrors this. It doesn't flood the economy with stimulus. It doesn't give handouts without boundaries. It doesn't pretend that growth comes from debt. It comes from discipline. At the end of the day, Japan isn't afraid of debt. It's afraid of dependency, afraid of becoming like the countries that sell their future for immediate comfort. It's afraid that if it starts borrowing recklessly, it won't be able to say no tomorrow. And that's not about economics. It's about identity. Their culture didn't evolve to chase boom. It evolved to survive bust. The most powerful nation in Asia doesn't need to prove anything to the world. It just needs to keep its own people calm, secure, and steady. That's the quiet ambition driving every budget, every tax law, every policy decision. Not expansion, preservation. And if you think this is outdated, that modern economies must grow at all costs, you're missing the point. Japan isn't stagnant. It's selective. It's investing in robotics, in aging care tech, in exporting precision manufacturing to a world desperate for reliability. It isn't spending to create a new middle class. It's maintaining the one it has with dignity, with foresight, with patience. You won't see it on CNBC. You won't read about it in Bloomberg. But when the next financial storm hits, and it will, Japan won't drown. It'll just keep walking. And maybe, just maybe, it's the only one who knows how to do it without breaking ... After World War II, Japan was ashes. Cities were bombed into silence. Factories lay in ruins. Yet within 20 years, it rose again, not with bombs or oil, but with precision, patience, and an almost religious focus on manufacturing. Tiny companies like Toyota and Sony didn't just rebuild, they redefined global standards. Workers put in 60-hour weeks. Families sacrificed vacations for training. The government backed them, not with bailouts but with long-term credit lines, low interest, and protection from foreign competition. This wasn't capitalism, as the West knew it. It was collective ambition, silently channeled through keiretsu networks, lifetime employment, and an unspoken contract. Work hard, and the nation will provide stability. By the 1980s, Japan was the envy of the world. Its electronics lined store shelves from London to Los Angeles. Its cars outlasted American models. Its banks dominated global finance. But beneath the shine, something fragile was growing. Real estate prices soared, not because of demand, but because money flowed into land, not productivity. Stocks tripled in 5 years. Entire neighborhoods were worth more than entire U.S. states. And when the bubble burst in 1991, it didn't just pop, it imploded. Tokyo's Imperial Palace grounds, valued at the same price as all real estate in California, suddenly became worthless. Banks were left holding trillions in bad loans. Companies collapsed overnight. Families lost everything. What followed wasn't just a recession. It was a generation of stagnation. The lost decades. Growth stalled. Wages flatlined. Young people faced unemployment, while their parents' pensions withered. The government panicked. It lowered interest rates to near zero. It built highways to nowhere. It poured money into public works projects just to keep people employed. And every time it did, the national debt climbed higher. Not because it was profligate, but because it was desperate. It kept spending because stopping meant mass layoffs, social unrest, a collapse of confidence. So it chose the slow burn over the crash. And slowly, painfully, it learned that borrowing to prop up a failing system doesn't fix the problem, it just hides it longer. But here's what most people never realize. Japan didn't just respond to that collapse. It changed its entire economic psychology. After the bubble, companies stopped chasing market share at all costs. Families stopped borrowing to buy bigger homes. Even the state stopped pretending that stimulus would magically revive demand. Instead, it began to treat debt like a medical condition. Something to be managed, not cured. New policies emerged, not to reduce debt, but to prevent it from ever becoming a weapon against the future. The lesson wasn't don't spend. It was don't borrow unless you absolutely must. And that mindset, forged in the fire of a national trauma, is what makes Japan different today. You hear about Greece, you hear about Italy, you hear about America's $34 trillion debt, and think it's normal because everyone else is doing it. But Japan lived the worst-case scenario. It saw what happens when you confuse paper wealth with real wealth, when you mistake credit for capability. And it chose a quieter path, not because it couldn't spend more, but because it refused to risk what it had left. It's not a policy. It's trauma turned into tradition. It's the reason, 30 years later, Japan still hesitates before writing another check. And it's the reason you should pay attention. Japan's national debt stands at 1.3 quadrillion yen. That's over $8 trillion, more than double its entire economy. By any conventional measure, this should be catastrophic. Yet there's no uproar, no market panic, no flood of selling. Why? Because almost no one outside Japan owns it. Over 90% of Japanese government bonds are held by domestic buyers, families, banks, pension funds. That's not luck. It's design. Most countries rely on foreign investors to finance their deficits. Japan doesn't need them. It finances itself from within. Half of those bonds are held by the Bank of Japan, the central bank. This isn't recent. It's been underway since 2013, under quantitative easing, but now it's institutionalized. The BOJ doesn't just buy bonds to cool yields, it buys them to anchor the entire financial system. Every time the government issues new debt, the BOJ steps in, quietly absorbing it before it ever hits public markets. That keeps interest rates suppressed, below 1%, often hovering near zero. You could borrow from the Japanese government for less than most Americans pay on their credit cards, and no one bats an eye. But here's what makes this work. Japanese households still save a lot. Even as wages stagnated and prices stayed flat, families kept socking away cash, not in stocks, not in crypto, but in government bonds. Why? Because safety matters more than returns. A retired teacher in Fukuoka doesn't need high yields. She needs her pension to keep paying out. A family in Osaka doesn't care about capital gains. They care that their savings won't vanish overnight. These aren't speculative investors. They're cautious stewards. And when you have tens of millions of people treating government bonds like heirlooms, not commodities, the system becomes shockproof. Compare this to the US, where foreign holders, China, Japan itself, own nearly a third of federal debt. That's a vulnerability. Any geopolitical shift, any dip in confidence, can trigger a sell-off. But Japan? If foreigners decide to dump Japanese bonds tomorrow, they wouldn't find many to dump. There's just no supply left to sell. It's all locked inside the country's own financial architecture. The government doesn't owe Wall Street. It owes its own grandparents, its own workers, its own banks, and those are the people who won't walk away. So yes, the number is terrifying, but the structure, it's quiet, deliberate, and deeply personal. The debt isn't a burden, it's a contract, a promise passed down in yen-denominated paper. And as long as Japanese people believe in that promise, the system holds. No magic, no miracle, just a nation that chose stability over spectacle. Japan doesn't just afford its debt. It sustains it in a way no other nation can. Not because it's rich, not because it's lucky, but because it's built a financial ecosystem so self-contained, so insulated from global chaos, that it operates like a closed-loop engine. The key isn't income, it's ownership. When 90% of government bonds are held by domestic savers and institutions, you're not borrowing from creditors. You're recycling your own money. Foreign investors? They hold less than 10%. That means no hedge funds can corner the market. No rating agencies can threaten a downgrade. No sudden loss of confidence from abroad can trigger a bond sell-off. Japan doesn't answer to Wall Street. It answers to its own people, and that's only the start. The Bank of Japan doesn't just buy bonds. It owns them outright, in massive, sustained volumes. Since 2013, it has purchased more than half of all new government debt issued. effectively turning public borrowing into internal accounting. Yields on 10-year Japanese bonds? They hover near 0.5%, not because the market demands it, but because the central bank won't let them rise. This isn't manipulation, it's stability engineering. The BOJ isn't printing money to fund extravagance. It's anchoring the entire system so that pensions, mortgages, and corporate loans all move in rhythm. And because inflation has remained stubbornly low for over 3 decades, there's no pressure to raise rates. No need to crush growth to protect the currency. No trade-off between spending and saving. Then there's the yen. You'd think a nation with this much debt would see its currency collapse. But the opposite is true. The yen remains one of the world's most trusted safe haven currencies. Why? Because Japan is the world's largest net creditor nation. It has more foreign assets than any other country. $3.5 trillion in overseas investments, from factories in Vietnam to real estate in New York. Even as it owes trillions internally, it lends more externally. When markets tremble from a war in the Middle East to a banking panic in Europe, money rushes into yen-denominated assets. Investors borrow yen cheaply, buy US or European bonds, and profit from the spread. This so-called carry trade doesn't destabilize Japan, it reinforces it. The more the yen is used globally, the more demand there is for Japanese government bonds, and the easier it becomes to finance the debt. But here's the deeper truth no one talks about. Japan doesn't need to reduce its debt, because it no longer sees debt as a liability. It sees it as a tool of social cohesion. When an elderly woman in Kobe buys a government bond with her life savings, she isn't investing for profit, she's trusting the state to honor her pension. When a small-town bank holds bonds to match its loan portfolios, it's not speculating, it's preserving livelihoods. This is economics shaped by memory, not math. After the asset bubble burst, the nation learned that financial panic kills faster than debt. That's why they don't chase growth at all costs. They chase predictability. They don't want booming markets. They want quiet mornings at neighborhood coffee shops, where retirees know their bills will be paid. This is why Japan refuses to borrow more, even when it could, because it already has the system it needs. The loop is closed. Citizens save, the central bank holds bonds, inflation stays low, the yen stays strong, and the economy just keeps going. There's no flashy innovation driving it, no bold reform shaking the foundations, just an old, unshakable belief that stability isn't boring, it's sacred, and in a world addicted to disruption, that's the most radical thing of all. Japan saves more than any advanced society on Earth, over 20% of household income, year after year, not because they're rich, but because they've been taught to fear the future. In post-war Tokyo, mothers reused rice sacks as curtains. Fathers repaired shoes with wire and glue. Children were told, save for tomorrow, because tomorrow might not come. That wasn't paranoia. It was survival, and that ethic never left. Even now, when Japan is the world's third largest economy, people still open bank accounts with 100 yen. They keep savings books tucked away like sacred texts. The average Japanese family has more than 4 million yen saved, not for a vacation or a new car, but because uncertainty demands it. You won't find many Japanese families with credit card debt. In fact, the average household credit card balance, less than $500. Compare that to America, where the average is over $6,000. Why? Because debt isn't a tool here. It's a social stigma. Borrowing to buy a house? Possible, but rarely celebrated. Borrowing to fund a wedding? Considered irresponsible. A university graduate wouldn't dream of financing a smartphone with a card. They'd wait. Save, buy used. The idea of living beyond your means isn't liberating here. It's vulgar. Confucian values still run deep. Humility, discipline, obligation to family, not to individual desire. The highest honor isn't owning more, it's needing less. This isn't just personal behavior, it's institutional. The government doesn't push consumer credit. Banks don't aggressively market loans. Even retirement systems aren't built to encourage spending. Instead, policies reward saving. Tax incentives for pension contributions, high-interest savings accounts for the elderly, mandatory corporate savings plans. The state mirrors the culture, cautious, consistent, unshowy. When the pandemic hit, Japan distributed cash, but not as handouts, as emergency reserves. People didn't spend it on trips or electronics. They deposited it. That's not lack of spirit. That's cultural resilience. And this mindset extends to how Japan approaches national spending. The government doesn't celebrate fiscal stimulus. It doesn't cheer when debt rises. It murmurs apologies. When it does borrow, it's never for luxury. It's for aging infrastructure, for elderly care, for disaster recovery. There's no parade for a new highway. No pride in a stadium built with borrowed money. Growth, if it comes, is quiet through precision engineering, through export excellence, through efficiency, not consumption. Japan doesn't want to be the biggest. It wants to be the most enduring. In a world chasing the next purchase, the next upgrade, the next debt-fueled boom, Japan chose a different path. Not because it couldn't spend, but because it remembered what hunger felt like. And in that memory, it found a kind of freedom, the freedom to live without fear, not because wealth protects you, but because restraint does. Japan's government doesn't print money because it's hungry for spending. It prints because it's forced to. There's no grand plan to inflate its way out of debt. Instead, there's a quiet, entrenched culture of restraint, codified in law, upheld in parliament, and reinforced by decades of bitter lessons. The balanced budget law, passed in 2015, doesn't eliminate borrowing, but it demands that any new debt be justified through multi-year revenue projections. If tax income doesn't rise, spending can't grow. No loopholes, no exceptions for emergencies. Even after the 2011 tsunami, when entire coastal towns vanished overnight, the government didn't launch a $1 trillion recovery. It prioritized repairs, not reinvention. Temporary shelters, not luxury housing. Rebuilding roads, not monuments. And it funded it through reallocation, shifting funds from non-essential programs, delaying minor infrastructure, not slashing pensions. The message was clear. Don't burden the future to fix the present. This discipline survived even Abenomics, the bold economic revival launched in 2013 under Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. It had 3 arrows: monetary easing, fiscal stimulus, and structural reform. The first 2 worked for a while. Inflation ticked up, stock markets soared, unemployment dropped. But the 3rd arrow, structural reform, it never landed. Instead of breaking vested interests, lifetime employment, agricultural subsidies, cozy keiretsu networks, the government tiptoed, and when growth stalled again, Abe didn't double down on spending. He doubled down on caution. He raised the consumption tax, publicly in stages, first to 8%, then 10% despite protests. not because he wanted to punish households, but because he knew stimulus without reform is just borrowing with fireworks. The Japanese parliament doesn't debate spending like Washington does. There are no televised shouting matches over $10 billion in infrastructure grants. Bills are reviewed in quiet, methodical committees. Opposition parties don't block spending out of ideology. They block it out of duty. They ask, where will this money come from in 5 years? Not, what can we build now? The political cost of reckless debt isn't electoral, it's moral. You don't earn votes by spending. You earn respect by restraint. And here's the unspoken truth. Japan doesn't avoid debt because it's rich. It avoids debt because it's running out of people. With nearly 30% of its population over 65, every yen spent today is a yen stolen from tomorrow's taxes. 1 in 4 children will one day support 2 elderly relatives. There's no room for waste, no luxury in extravagance. The government doesn't say no to spending because it's poor. It says no because it sees the math. And in a society that never forgets, the math always catches up. The system Japan has built is strong but not invincible. It holds together because every piece is carefully balanced. Low yields, domestic ownership, steady savings, and cultural caution. But if even one pillar cracks, the whole structure trembles. What if the Bank of Japan suddenly stops buying bonds? What if inflation spikes, not from wages, but from a fractured global supply chain? The yen, already fragile under rising U.S. rates, could plunge. Japan imports 90% of its energy and nearly all its food. A 20% drop in the yen's value means fuel and fertilizer double in price overnight. Groceries vanish from shelves. Elderly couples skip meals. And suddenly, the debt isn't just numbers on a balance sheet, it's hunger in the streets. Or imagine this, a geopolitical shock. Taiwan, the Korean Strait, a cyber attack on Tokyo's financial systems, sparks panic among domestic savers. They rush to pull money out of government bonds, seeking safety overseas. The BOJ can't buy fast enough. Yields climb, interest payments balloon. The government, already stretched thin supporting pensions, must choose: cut health care, raise taxes, print more money. Each option destroys trust. And once trust breaks, this closed-loop economy collapses inward, faster than any foreign investor ever could. This isn't theoretical. It's the quiet fear behind every Japanese fiscal meeting. The government doesn't ignore these risks. It prepares for them. That's why it's investing in robotics to offset labor shortages, why it's quietly expanding LNG terminals to reduce foreign energy dependence, why it's offering tax breaks to companies that bring manufacturing home, not to protect jobs, but to secure supply chains. It's even allowing more elderly workers to stay on past 70, not out of kindness, but out of necessity. The real danger isn't debt, it's complacency. The belief that because nothing has broken yet, nothing ever will. Japan's restraint isn't a law of economics. It's a moral contract between generations. And if the next generation feels that contract is being broken, if they see their parents' pensions funded by their own future taxes, if they inherit a nation whose only solution is to print more money than ever before, they'll stop saving. They'll stop buying bonds. And then the silence will end. Not with a scream, but with a sigh, a quiet decision to walk away. And once that happens, no amount of policy can bring it back. Japan doesn't solve its problems by spending more. It solves them by doing more with less. With a workforce shrinking by 400,000 people every year, the nation didn't wait for baby boomers to retire. It armed factories with robots. Now, 1 in every 4 industrial robots in the world is in Japan. In warehouses outside Osaka, autonomous carts glide silently beside elderly workers, none of them replaced, all of them empowered. A 68-year-old quality inspector now oversees 3 automated lines, his experience guiding algorithms that detect defects invisible to the naked eye. Productivity isn't measured in hours worked. It's measured in output per person. And output is rising. Exports didn't die when China rose, they evolved. Japanese auto parts now dominate global supply chains, hidden inside Teslas, Audis, and Mercedes. The company that makes the tiny sensors in your phone, likely Japanese. The lithium-ion battery tech in your laptop, patented in Nagoya. Japan doesn't sell smartphones. It sells the bones inside them. And when global travel rebounded after 2022, Japan didn't just welcome tourists. It re-engineered access. Visa waivers expanded. Rural ryokans trained staff in 6 languages. Train stations installed AI kiosks that didn't just sell tickets, but personalized itineraries based on your walking speed. In 2024, Japan hosted 31 million visitors, the most ever, and each one spent more than the year before. Not because of flashy ads, but because reliability, cleanliness, and hospitality became a branded national offering. Then came Womenomics, not a slogan, a system. Corporate Japan, once infamous for pushing women out after childbirth, now offers subsidies for childcare, mandated paternity leave, and tax credits for companies that promote women into management. In 2023, Japan hit a record high, 37% of middle management roles held by women, not because of quotas, but because companies realized they couldn't afford to lose talent. A single mother in Fukuoka now works 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., her shift synced with school hours, her promotion tracked by performance, not presence. Her paycheck funds her child's school and her company's profit. The economy isn't just growing, it's reshaping itself around what people actually need. But the big question lingers. Can innovation outpace decline? Can robots and tourism and female labor fill the void left by 3 million fewer workers by 2040? Can productivity gains translate into real wage growth, or just deeper reliance on machines? Japan doesn't claim to have all the answers. It just refuses to gamble on borrowed time. Every robot purchased, every visa granted, every child care center built, each is a quiet bet that efficiency can replace quantity, that dignity can replace debt, that a nation doesn't need to multiply its people to multiply its value. It just needs to think differently. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Japan quotes secret isn't wealth, it's wisdom. It doesn't avoid debt because it can't borrow. It avoids it because it remembers what borrowing cost. Domestic ownership keeps pressure from overseas at bay. Culture teaches restraint over revelry. Policy enforces discipline, not desperation. The Bank of Japan doesn't chase growth. It protects stability. And when the world screams for stimulus, Japan whispers, "What if we don't need more debt to be strong?" Look around. Most nations treat debt like oxygen. Necessary, endless, unavoidable. Japan treats it like medicine. Potent, dangerous, only used when life depends on it. Its economy doesn't thrive because it spends boldly. It thrives because it refuses to gamble with its future. Even with 29% of its people over 65, even with a shrinking workforce, even with global uncertainty, it finds a way to endure, not explode. This isn't a model for the world to copy. It's one to contemplate. What if sustainability isn't about how much you can borrow, but how little you must? What if true prosperity isn't measured in GDP growth, but in peace of mind? If you're tired of hearing that debt is inevitable, if you're ready to consider that discipline might be the real innovation, then this is just the beginning. Subscribe for more economic stories you won't hear anywhere else, because sometimes the quietest nations teach the loudest lessons.